Well, a very good morning to you all. Here in European Parliament, my name is Rihards Kols. I'm the member of the European Parliament, a member of the ECR group, and I warmly welcome you all today here for the first in a series of discussions on the authoritarian cooperation threatening European security. And for this occasion, we begin with the axis of Russia and Iran, a partnership that demands urgent and sober assessment. So this Russia's aggression in Ukraine and beyond, and Iran's destabilizing activities are not separate phenomena. They are increasingly fused strategically, operationally, and ideologically. Together, they amplify each other's reach, capabilities, and ambitions. And we must understand this cooperation as a whole if we really want to counter it effectively. So for the scope of this threat, which ranges from the Baltic cyber networks to Ukrainian battlefields, from Israeli airspace to European energy grids, this axis challenges the security architecture we depend on. Their malign activities are not isolated attacks. They are parts of coordinated and evolving strategy. So this is not a distant problem here in Europe. It strikes at the NATO's cohesion, at European democratic resilience, and at the political will needed to defend them. So this is only beginning. We will turn next to Russia-China axis later this year. And another critical pillar of the global authoritarian front that is gaining momentum as we see events unfold, be it in Europe, be it in Middle East, and be it in South China Sea as well. And we really need to understand the alignments of these, and requires more than the conversation and more than a perspective. So I hope you will leave today with more questions, questioning these alliances that for the past few years has really gaining momentum when the West is engaged in not very constructive cooperation, I would say, and especially in light of transatlantic bond that we're witnessing for the past 100 days has really shaken up the relationships in different formats and forms as well. So those are my introductory remarks for today's event. As I mentioned, the axis, and I put always right now additional term, axis of evil, are really gaining the momentum through strategic partnership. It's not anymore ad hoc cooperation where, self-national interest driven. It's a common effort to take down, I would say, the rules-based international order, at least that we have witnessed for the past 80 years. And today, we'll focus on Russia and Iran. And now I give the floor to our moderator for today's panel, Joris van Bladel, who is a senior fellow at the Egmont, Belgium Institute for International Affairs. He will be in charge of pushing our experts, and I have to say our lineup for the panel is really distinguished. We have expert on Ukraine, Russia, we have expert on Middle East, on Iran, and we have expert on the Western capabilities, the capabilities to deter these threats that are posed by autocratic regimes. With no further ado, please, Mr. Bladel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Kols. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to precede this panel. As you said, my name is Joris van Bladel. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at the Egmont Institute here in Brussels, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you today to this panel on the Russian-Iranian alignment and its threats to European interests and its specific security implications for the Baltics, Israel, and Ukraine. Over the past years, the deepening strategic partnership between Russia and Iran has profoundly reshaped the security environment surrounding Europe, its eastern neighbors, and key allies. The growing alignment poses multifaceted challenges from military cooperation and hybrid threats to destabilizing activities across different theaters. This morning, we are fortunate to have with us three distinguished experts. each bringing unique regional and thematic perspectives to help us better understand the nature of these challenges and their consequences for European security. We will first hear, and I present now the panelists, we first hear Mr. James Sherr, Honorary Fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, and an Associate Fellow at Chatham House. He is a leading expert on Ukraine, Russia, and European security. Mr. Sherr has advised NATO and the UK on Ukraine for more than 2 decades. On my left, Dr. Sarah Masha Fainberg, Senior Researcher and Head of the Great Powers Research Program at the Elrum Center for Air and Space Studies at the University of Tel Aviv. Dr. Fainberg's expertise lies in Russian and Chinese influence in the Middle East, with prior strategic roles in Israel's Ministry of Defense and European Israeli initiatives. On the far right, there is Dr. Edward Hunter Christie. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and formerly a NATO official. He brings expertise in defense economics and transatlantic security with academic credentials spanning economics and military sciences. After their initial remarks, we will open the floor to a broader discussion among our panelists, followed by a Q&A session with you, the audience. And so without further delay, let me now invite our first speaker, Mr. James Sherr, to share his insights on Russian affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kols, Mr. Vladel, distinguished members of the European Parliament and distinguished experts. The Russia-Iran relationship today is a sobering example of how 2 countries and peoples who dislike one another and do not trust one another can nevertheless cooperate very effectively, rigorously, and in detail in advancing a deeply felt set of common interests. Having said that, let me focus on my core areas of expertise, which concern Russia and Europe. And in doing so, let me test your patience by focusing at least a third of my remarks on context. Context is everything, and if we're talking about context, history is almost everything. And unfortunately, one reason we have often been taken by surprise in this war is because whilst Putinology might be highly advanced in some quarters, knowledge of the wider context and history is far less impressive. What are the basic, what the Russians would call основные положения, the basic founding principles concerning Russia's outlook, not only towards Ukraine, but this wider environment and space, including all of Europe? First, for hundreds of years, Russians have acquired a habit and an ability to incorporate the history of other peoples they have been connected with into their own and into their own identity. I can simply recall one conspicuously liberal head of a Russian institute in the early 2000s who said to an audience of young Ukrainians and Moldovans, "Ukraine is part of my identity as a Russian." No sense of irony. I have sat in rooms in Kiev where very senior people have told Ukrainians who they are not, what they might do and what they might not do, and what courses are historically ruled out for them. Secondly, in Russia, as the biggest, most impressive, most lasting landed empire we've had in Europe, possibly the world, borders have always been a source of insecurity, both for them and for others, particularly given the paucity of natural frontiers, and this has always meant an emphasis on creating defense perimeters, client states, and spheres of influence, irrespective of the people who inhabit these particular spaces. And third point I would simply make is that Russia has, sometimes with apprehension, often with pride, defined itself in Europe as a civilizational other, but also exhibited what I would call an only child syndrome, meaning needing and desiring autonomy and inclusion at the same time, and insisting on a right to both. Now, the fundamental principles about Russia and Ukraine, they long predate Putin, although Ukraine has long been a private obsession of his, and I have witnessed it at work more than once. But the default Russian view of Ukraine has been that Ukraine is an extension of the Russian homeland. And since 1992, since Russia accepted Ukraine's and recognized Ukraine's juridical independence, its policy has directly and more or less explicitly, very explicitly, been aimed at making Russia the arbiter of what Ukraine's independence consists of, what it does not consist of, and how they are to be achieved. And this entire approach, very seriously formulated and backed and reinforced, has tended to fail again and again. And those failures on two key occasions led to war in 2014, and again, an expansion of the war in 2022. That is the immediate background. Why does the Russian state leadership today, as of today, perceive that Russia is winning? And I would underscore that they do perceive they are winning. By the way, I missed making some fundamental points about Ukraine, but I might tack them on at the end. The good news for us, we need to bear in mind, is that never in Russian history has there been an example of Russia attacking a stronger power, a power it regards as stronger. Why don't they regard us as stronger? I assure you they don't. I was at a lunch with the head of a NATO intelligence service after 2014. He said to me, why are we so concerned our GDP is, I think at that time, 15, 20 times what theirs is. And I replied to him, wars are not won by GDP ratios. Wars are won, and the Russians understand this, by the conversion of national attributes into usable power. And national attributes, to a very large extent, includes what the Russians call the moral factor. Your belief system. Do you understand your belief system? Do you really believe in your belief system? What sacrifices are you willing to make? What risks are you ready to assume? How much tenacity do you have? How much knowledge do you have of exactly what it is you are doing and how to do it, and exactly who your opponent is and how he thinks? All these intangibles often make the majority of factors that decide how wars are won and who wins them. And measured against these metrics, I have to tell you that to this day, the Russian assessment of the United States, NATO, Europe, has not been very high, and they have had an absolute faith that if they could survive such penalties as we are willing to impose upon them, we will lose the appetite and lose the ability for imposing these penalties, and they will be able to widen divisions, find the interfaces, and aggravate them and sharpen them and play across them. And that is certainly the case now that Donald Trump has come to office. I will say nothing more about him now, but I anticipate questions. Secondly, once Russia's initial plans for subjugating Ukraine after February 22 proved to be so catastrophically faulty, they did what Russians often do very well. They decided we have to reconsider everything. Certainly not the wisdom of what our objectives are, but how we are doing it. And one thing they realized is we must enlist the external factor, which is one reason we are here and one reason Sarah is going to talk about Iran later. Without the external factor, I do not think this war would be continuing today. Sarah is going to talk about Iran. Suffice to say, for me, that on my side, that China today, by expert assessments, is supplying the Russia defense industrial complex with some 70% of its machine tools and 90% of its microprocessors. Edward, who is a defense economist, might challenge me on those figures, but it is substantial. There are now 5,000 Cuban mercenaries fighting in the war. We don't even hear about the Cubans. We hear about presumably 12,000 North Koreans and others. Third question, why is there no necessity for them to win this war? In all of 2024, even in the latter stages after the economy was put on a militarized and war economy footing, Russian armed forces advanced at a maximum, any salient, 45 kilometers, in the course of which over that year lost some 400,000 people, that is to say, either killed outright or placed hors de combat because of the seriousness of their wounds. A year earlier, in 2023, before the Russians readjusted their strategy, you will recall there was something called the Prigozhin Putsch. General Prigozhin, it's not only that General Prigozhin succeeded in launching an operation that paralyzed the state for a critical few days and took him almost to the Moscow ring road, but he was backed by some of the most capable and senior generals in the armed forces. Why? Because they understood that the strategy they were presently embarked upon was leading to disaster and that the war was going to be lost. It makes it a very important point. Russian armies that are defeated are threats to the state. Russian armies that believe they are winning are never threats to the state. Russian citizens, Russian people, even before there were citizens, serfs, whoever, no matter how badly they are treated, no matter how many of them die, and no matter what the numbers are, they do not revolt if the state is in charge and the state is winning. The Soviet Union as a whole lost something between 20 and 27 million in the last war. That 27 million has given them a sense of pride. That made the victory seem all that much greater. That's the way it works in Russia. The greater the sacrifice we absorb, the more powerful we are in the end. This is a psychology. Now, we are at a position where we have a very favorably constructed dilemma that we are dealing with. We have it well within our means, without going to war ourselves, even now, and putting troops on the ground, of giving the state leadership a choice between either instituting general mobilization of the country, which they are absolutely loth to do because they see it as something that will threaten their internal stability and their own power, or reassessing their aims. It's a proverbial Russian scissors crisis where two of these imperatives come together and the scissors start closing. But our strategy is not focused on bringing those scissors together. It hasn't been all the time we have been supporting Ukraine. I promised, and I had neglected it before, in 90 seconds remaining, just to make a few points about Ukraine so that my points about Russia are not hovering in a vacuum. Of course, there are very important commonalities historical commonalities between Ukraine and Russia. Of course, there has been, over the centuries, a very intimate set of relationships that have been developed, some of them, in a positive sense, very strong. But the historical dynamics and the social consequences and political consequences of those dynamics, on balance, have been profoundly different. Russia arose out of Moscovia, out of Muscovy, which, unlike all the other parts of medieval Rus, was established and remained an absolute monarchy. And as soon as the Mongol armies were contested, Russia launched a process of expansion which made it impossible to distinguish state and empire. It immediately encompassed other people. And nevertheless, by the beginning of the reign of Ivan IV, Ivan Grozny, the process of the gathering of Russian lands did not encroach even upon 1 square kilometer of the territory that we now call Ukraine, which had developed alongside different significant others. Ukraine has been a domain that evolved through contact on the fault lines of different political jurisdictions, different social and religious influences, and as a result, over time, Ukraine's entire modus operandi has been focused on pluralism, maneuver, manipulation, compromise, weak state, weak central authority, incompetence, corruption, but underneath it, very strong civil society. People who are capable of depending entirely on themselves. Civil society has always been anathema in the Russian system, and it has never been properly understood. These are very different countries and very different societies. And if you spend time with each, you feel it. And every time you get on a plane from Kiev to Moscow, you have to recompose yourself because you know you're going into a different space where people walk differently, they talk differently, they reason differently. I'm now over my time, and I didn't end at the most logical moment. But I would just say, finally, if we have not helped Ukraine secure convincing and definitive results out of this war, it is not because of a lack of commitment or knowledge on the part of Ukrainians. It is because, for many reasons, we have lacked the understanding and the will to do so.
Thank you, James. The sentence, the greater the sacrifice, the greater the victory, is for me one of the essence of Russian military culture, which is so far away from the Western idea and the Western defense thinking. Therefore, the sentence is very important to me to mention. But allow me to ask me one quick question. The general idea is that nowadays Russia is on the upper hand on the front line. You seem to challenge this. Is it correct?
Yes, I am challenging it. Today, 70% of the Russian servicemen who are killed on the front line are being killed by drones, missiles, other indirect remote-fired weapons. So the factors, the imbalances which are there to Ukraine's detriment, the manpower imbalances mainly, and not complete, but significant weaknesses of the mobilization system. They're offset by other factors. At a technological level now, Ukraine's defense industry in many spheres is one of the 2 or 3 most capable in Europe, and the EU is interested, fortunately, in advancing, in investing in an expanding investment. Russia, very adroitly, is playing catch-up technologically with Ukraine now, but they are playing catch-up.
It's a follower, actually, in the innovation.
Yes,
in the innovation war.
You're dealing with this, with the economic and military consequences, again, of a society that works exceptionally well at the micro level. People are very comfortable taking the initiative. They're not comfortable working for others, but they'll do it themselves, where they even have, you can't get central supplies of basic things. You order them on the internet because there are all sorts of Ukrainian private companies like mushrooms that spread up and produce warm socks and food when you need, all the rest of it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, very partial answer.
Thank you. Let us now continue with Dr. Sarah Fainberg, please.
Honorable members of Parliament, Honorable Rihards Kols, distinguished colleagues, today Europe doesn't confront 2 isolated threats. It faces an interconnected, intertwined, and globalized front, the accelerating convergence of Moscow and Tehran. Through the growing rapprochement in the past decade, the European and Middle Eastern theaters have become entangled laboratories of war. Both Russia and Iran, as was mentioned before, have enhanced their offensive capabilities through deepened military cooperation, cross-domain knowledge diffusion in air, space, but also the nuclear domain, and operational testing in both Ukraine and my home country, Israel. The growing linkage between Russia and Iran is not confined to the military empowerment. It now extends into the diplomatic arena. And as was mentioned by James, diplomacy is the continuation of war, both for the Russians and the Iranians. The US-led negotiations towards a settlement in Ukraine are increasingly linked, intertwined with efforts to broker a new nuclear arrangement with Iran, negotiations in which Russia aspires to play a pivotal role. At the core of these dynamics lies what I call a hyper-transactional relationship between Russia and Iran, a relationship that goes beyond ad hoc, immediate, transactional consideration, but still falls short of a full-fledged alliance. It is driven by operational expediency, sanctions, circumvention by the two most heavily sanctioned states globally, geopolitical isolation, and a shared defiance of the West. So my core message today is the following. European leaders must fully integrate the Russia-Iran convergence into strategic and operational planning, assessing its operational implications for Europe and the Middle East, and forging a unified multi-front response. So let us first trace the evolution of this marriage of convenience and then explore together how Europe might either leverage or fracture this relationship depending on its strategic necessity. So historically, as James mentioned, Russia-Iran relations are defined by deep mutual distrust and conflicting interests across the South Caucasus, the Caspian Sea, and the Middle East. In the 1990s and the 2000s, this reflected mainly a patron-client relationship, with Iran deeply reliant on Moscow's technological and military assistance, even though Moscow periodically delayed transfers of equipment to balance American and Israeli interests. We can talk about this, and uphold non-proliferation norms. Two key moments fundamentally altered the relationship. Moscow's entry into Syria, when Moscow and Tehran decided together to save the almost defunct Assad regime, and of course, the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine by the aggressor that catalyzed Iran's direct provision of Shaheeds 131 and 136 to Russia's battlefield operation. And it was the first significant reliance by Moscow on a foreign defense supplier, again strengthening your point, James, about Moscow's deep dependence on foreign assistance in Ukraine. And since the middle of 2022, the bilateral ties have evolved into the hyper-transactional phase, marked by deeply expanded technical security collaboration, increased arms transfers and battlefield knowledge sharing, growing institutionalization, culminating in the recently ratified so-called comprehensive strategic partnership. We can talk about this. And key developments included increased cooperation in space, with Russia launching Iranian satellites and greatly improving Iran's anti-jamming capabilities, and leveraging joint operational experiences, both in Ukraine and Israel. It included battlefield operations. More than 10,000 Iranian-designed drones, Shahed drones, have been deployed in Ukraine since mid-2022. And of course, in return, Russia has provided Iran with Mi-28 helicopters, Yak 130 jet trainers, and most importantly, access to captured Western NATO defense technologies. And I come to my third point, which is most critical, at least for the Middle East, which is nuclear diplomacy shifts. Russia previously styled itself as the adult in the room, as the responsible actor brokering negotiations between the West, the E3, the United States, and Iran. But since mid-2022, Russia's position has tilted on the nuclear file in favor of Iran, motivated by wartime gratitude, of course, a shared multipolar vision, and a commercial interest in the Iranian market. And I'll add to this, James, another point, which is ideology. You talked about ideology, and we have a new marriage, a toxic marriage between two countries whose messianic ideology converges with increased nuclear empowerment. This is the Russian nuclear orthodoxy, the marriage between the Orthodox Church and the nuclear forces in Russia. And this is the Islamist eschatology of Iran combined with the nukes. And the two together present a grave danger both for Europe and the Middle East. Yet complexity persists. Despite cooperation, Russia still withholds critical assets from Iran despite Iran's insistence, including the S-400 air defense systems and the Su-35 fighter aircraft, capabilities that are crucial to safeguarding Iran's airspace, especially following severe degradation by Israeli counterstrikes in April and October last year. The evolution of the Russian-Iranian nuclear cooperation poses a particularly acute strategic risk. Iran's leverage over Russia has increased over its support in Ukraine. James made that point earlier. though this alignment could shift depending on the results of Trump's negotiation, both on the Ukrainian track and in the Middle Eastern track. Also, while Russia, at least at a declarative level, remains committed to the non-proliferation norms, it may benefit strategically from Iran maintaining a nuclear threshold posture. It exacerbates regional and global uncertainty, and this is a disorder that Russia is leveraging in front of the United States. Specific risks include, of course, diplomatic cover for Iran, but most importantly, potential informal support for Iran's nuclear weapons development through informal, scientific, and technological exchange. And here the devil is in the detail. What matters most is not what is happening in the comprehensive strategic agreements, but it is what is happening between the community of Russian and Iranian experts at the informal level that may very significantly reduce the time from the breakout to the bomb for the Iranian. Of course, the other problem is the transfer of dual-use technologies that are critical to the enrichment cycle and the spent fuel reprocessing, and really catalyze the weaponization process. Other risks include Russia's potential assistance in nuclear reactor design and expanded nuclear technical training. And of course, but this is a less likely possibility, Russia leasing or transferring nuclear-powered submarines to Iran, replicating earlier Russia-India models. However, constraints remain in that relationship in the nuclear cooperation. First, it is my assessment that Russia will do everything to safeguard its technological superiority and will be reluctant to transfer critical know-how to Iran. And Iran, for its part, and this is part of the ideology of Khomeini, will avoid over-dependence on Russia and on China, for that matter, and will do everything to preserve operational secrecy around its most sensitive nuclear advancements. So now let's talk about the negotiations. In a surreal twist, Russia, the architect of Europe's largest conflict since 1945, now postures itself, and it is typical, this is à la Russe, as a responsible stabilizer on the Iranian file, employing strategic linkage, offering apparent cooperation on Iran to extract concessions on Ukraine and bolster its status as a global power or as a global broker. But the main question, my friends, is to understand whether Russia can deliver on the Iranian file. And my assessment is that it is fooling the United States, it is fooling Europe, and Russia cannot deliver on the Iranian file, despite its ambition to do so. Moscow lacks sufficient influence to compel Iran's supreme leader Khomeini to concede to Western demands. And of course, Tehran's preference for Oman as a mediator and not for Moscow underscores its deep distrust of Russia as an intermediary. However, Tehran is closely monitoring the evolving Trump-Putin dynamic, and should Russia or China withdraw support, Iran's strategic calculus and its options in a crisis would narrow sharply. So Europe is facing a range of strategic imperatives. Europe faces a rising multidimensional threat stemming from the Russian-Iranian convergence. First, from the combined missile and drone threats from Russia and Iran. I've experienced them firsthand, both in Kiev and in Tel Aviv. It faces increased nuclear risks from potential Russian-Iranian cooperation that will jeopardize global non-proliferation norms and regional stability in the Middle East, with strategic reverberations in Europe. of course, it faces expanded information warfare coming from Iran and Russia. Europe, in my view, has 5 urgent imperatives. First, adopt a multi-front strategic lens. Ukraine, Iran, the Middle East, and now Northeast Asia must be viewed as a continuum, as an integrated security system. Incidentally, Japan now has stepped in and has decided to provide Ukraine with key satellite intelligence. This is an interesting move. 2, safeguard European interest in negotiations. Europe should not be the orphan in the room and has to ensure that negotiations over Ukraine and Iran are not rushed or designed at the expense of European security imperatives. And I would say that the Ukrainian security imperatives are the European security imperatives, with no concessions and no exception. Third, prepare to trigger the JCPOA snapback sanctions. You have until October to do that. If no substantial progress is achieved, and this is a message that was communicated by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs just this morning, JCPOA signatories must be ready to reimpose sanctions before the snapback provision expires in October 2025. Ironically, James, this is Lavrov, who was the architect of the snapback sanctions initiative, but this is a present that is given to Europe at the moment. Strengthen export controls on dual use and critical technology. And for this, the Europeans are invited to use Ukrainian and Israeli assistance on battlefield forensics. We are gathering lots of toys coming from Russia and Iran, and this is a space for increased cooperation. And of course, the last point, I think that if there is something that Ukraine and Israel can share with their European friends and partners, is the idea of rebuilding total defense. War is not about armies. War is now about societies and people. Strengthen European air defense, bolster rapid reaction capabilities, and prepare your societies for integral war through a comprehensive total defense approach. The Russia-Iran axis, and I'll conclude with this, is not a temporary or historical anomaly. It is a hyper-transactional accelerator of global disorder. If we fail to act clearly, collectively, clear-eyed, and courageously, we will awaken to a world reshaped by nuclear proliferation, regional wars, interconnected regional wars, and strategic fragmentation. Thank you.
You make my work a lot easier by being so disciplined and keeping the time inside. So thank you for that.
Sorry, Joris, just a technical note.
Sorry.
So any speaker, please use your microphone on your left. Thank you. Oh.
Okay, sorry. So I keep this out. Is this okay then? All right, sorry. Charles Tilly, the historian and sociologist, once said that states make war and war makes states. Apparently, based on your alliances make war and war make alliances. Just a very quick question preceding our panel discussion, but what a potential peace would bring in this relationship, because it's a very fragile relationship apparently. So in case of a peace deal, how unjust this will be for the Ukrainians, but do you see how Iranian-Russian relations will react on it?
First of all, I will not, the wording is important here. The expression peace deal is an insult. So we will talk about agreements, deals, and transactions. The Russian-Iranian alignment has been historically, in the past 2 decades, a factor of two relationships, the Russian-American relationship and the Iranian-American relationship. And now we are in a strange dynamics in which the Russians are trying to decompartmentalize or decouple the normalization process with the United States with the negotiations over Ukraine, conceding as little concessions as possible. You've all heard the interview of Lavrov, surreal interview with maximalist demands on Ukraine. Russia has kept its maximalist demands approach. So it is to expect that the concessions will be minimal. And on the Iranian side also trying to decouple the normalization process from the Iranian file. So it is a very, very tricky dynamic in which the Russians are observing the dynamics of the Iranian-US rapprochement. The Iranians are observing the Russian-American dynamics. Every party is afraid that the other will have the cake and eat it too, earlier than the other. So it's going to be, this relationship will evolve and be fashioned by the dynamics of the negotiations between Russia and the US and Iran and the US. So it is difficult to predict how it will evolve. I know that over the years, the Iranians' nightmare was Russian-American rapprochement. And what kept the Russians up at night was an Iranian-American rapprochement, against the interests of the Russians. So it's it's early to tell. We are in the fog of war and in the fog of negotiations, but all will depend on the contours of those putative arrangements, if indeed they are inked at the end, which is not certain.
Thank you. Now we turn to the third and last speaker, and I guess you will have a more, let's say, Western view of the whole debate and the whole dynamic that is taking place in the area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joris, and good morning, everyone. I will indeed focus on the Western response, on the European response, and I'm going to keep this at a relatively broad level of strategic reflection. I'm really going to talk about deterrence. So we have a threat picture that has been presented to us coming from Russia and from Iran. And of course, we all know that the European Union and European states at the national level, and there's also plenty going on through NATO still, we have defense budgets going up. We have more investment in our defense industries. We have identified capability gaps. A lot is happening, which is good. But I believe we have to talk about deterrence in somewhat more detail, but also from almost an emotional and political perspective. So that will be my approach. So deterrence is often, traditionally, analyzed according to the so-called 3 C's, so 3 times the letter C: capability, credibility, and communication. And in an alliance context, whether it's NATO or European Union, or possibly some ad hoc coalition of the willing, one could add a 4th C, which would be cohesion. And analysts, some people come up with 3 C's, 4 C's, 5 C's. Lots of good publications on this, but I'll focus on those 4, or I suggest to the audience to reflect on those 4. Without doing a detailed breakdown, I think it's fair to say that Europe is weakened and is certainly not strong enough on any of the 4 C's in a scenario where we have Russia on the rampage, as it is, with Iran helping Russia, as the previous speakers identified, and with the United States not being quite so reliable anymore and being potentially engaged in other concerns, whether in the Indo-Pacific or its own hemisphere or internally. It is difficult to predict what will happen exactly with the United States, and there's discussions back and forth as to the reliability of America's commitment to NATO. But the fact is that the only responsible thing to do is to design European defense under an assumption of less American support and, in the worst case scenario, no American support. And if that is the scenario one has, then the 4 C's of deterrence that I listed earlier, capability, credibility, communication, and cohesion, we are weak on all 4. We do not have enough military capabilities, whether conventional or nuclear. We do not have credibility because we do not have a record of threatening Russia and making Russia back off by flexing our military muscles. I'm talking about the Europeans alone. This is not a black and white picture, of course. I think Russians probably understand that attacking Finland would be a bad idea, that attacking Poland would be a bad idea, that directly attacking France or the UK would be a bad idea. But nevertheless, we do have a credibility gap. We also have one hell of a communication gap. In fact, not only us, the United States has an awful recent record of communicating on deterrence. Yes. Basically green-lighted Russia invading Ukraine by making it absolutely clear that, you know, there's no Article 5 for Ukraine. We see your buildup, you shouldn't do it, but, you know, it's not a NATO member. And so, of course, the invasion proceeded. And a lot of the signals that European leaders sent out as the war unfolded, European leaders, but also American leaders, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I look at this and I really wonder. I mean, this gives me the sense that the United States of America is clearly, openly, incredibly reluctant to envisage a scenario of going to war against the Russian Federation. Now, intuitively, you might say, well, that's good. I mean, who wants massive great power war, a direct large-scale war between the United States and Russia? But the fact is, the security of Europe was based on the assumption that the United States would have the commitment, the credibility, the courage to take those enormous risks for us and for itself. So we are weaker on all of those dimensions. And so we have to work on all of them as Europeans, nationally and at the EU level, and at the level of coalitions of the willing. And as a side note, this also concerns the problem of cohesion. I think we also have to think the cohesion variable differently. The traditional EU way of looking at cohesion is obviously by definition cohesion of EU member states, which in many cases may involve having to have all EU member states agree. We have the diversity we have. That's not always the most efficient. So efficient cohesion is also important. And we have to be aware of not falling to the lowest common denominator, which is often a problem. But I will try to lift your spirits somewhat with my remarks. We do have a fantastic power potential. We have 440 million people. We have a GDP of almost, what is it, 19 to 20 trillion euros or dollars. It's about 10 times the GDP of Russia. But as James rightly said earlier, you don't win a war based on GDP alone. You have to transform your GDP and population into effective capabilities and credibility and cohesion and everything else. You need to have that transformation into military power and resolve matters a great deal in that context. So I do want to talk at an emotional level for a moment, but also introducing another concept, which is part of the typical deterrence discussion. And that is deterrence, what's called deterrence by punishment versus deterrence by denial. If you look at the white paper of the European Commission, the REARM, which had to be renamed Readiness 2030, the word deterrence appears in the document many times, I think 11 times or something. The specific expression deterrence by denial does not, deterrence by punishment does not appear, and I believe the other one doesn't appear either. So it's just deterrence, yes, this will be good for deterrence and this and that, but effectively, the document is a mix of the two, but mostly, the way I read it, it's mostly deterrence by denial rather than deterrence by punishment. Well, that's kind of interesting because, I mean, with 440 million people and a 20 trillion GDP, shouldn't we be powerful enough to do deterrence by punishment and frighten and intimidate potential enemies like Russia and Iran? We should have that power. There's no reason why we, Europe, do not have that power. So then the question is, well, you know, why do we not have that? And I think here there's maybe an almost cultural issue at play, a matter of political culture, a matter of European history, a matter of history of the European project. We have to think about those things, but I wish, what I want to do here is also to appeal to the emotional level. And I'll put it like this in stark terms. Do we want any one of our towns or cities in this union to undergo what happened to Mariupol? Now, if you're patriotic for this union, your answer must be a resounding no. And I'm sure that everyone in this chamber agrees with that. But the thing is then we have to transform that emotion, that right emotional impulse, into the way we think about deterrence, so that potentially we strengthen the side of the discussion which is about deterrence by punishment. Because I believe that any potential aggressor, and Russia included, and for that matter Iran as well, understand punishment and understand potential punishment and feel fear, potentially. But of course, currently they do not feel much fear. And think about this specifically on the Iranian connection. For the most part, for most European countries, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a country with which we do not have that many direct disputes. We've not had previously that many direct disputes or problems. Iran mainly has its sort of expansionist ambitions and aggressive proxy actors all over the Middle East. And then all of a sudden, there is a war in Europe, and the Iranians find it fit to supply ordnance to the Russian Federation in order to bomb European cities. And frankly, as a European citizen, I'm very angry about that, and I have not seen enough anger from fellow Europeans. It's unacceptable that the Iranians supply explosives to the Russian Federation, delivery systems that end up bombing European cities. And Kyiv is a European city, and the other cities in Ukraine are all European cities. We should have responded to Iran in a much stronger way. We did not, and so they continue working with the Russians in helping aggression against a European country. Do we think that the Iranians are going to stop helping the Russians in case Russia expands the scope of its aggression against Europe? We basically let it go. Same is true for North Koreans, by the way. So we do have to defend ourselves. We do need deterrence. I think that European institutions, national and the EU institutions, including this parliament, I think must seize itself of discussions on deterrence, even if some of the necessary policies are not entirely within your remit or your competencies. But we have to have, at the European level, a fundamental discussion about deterrence. We need to understand its features, its characteristics, the main two types of deterrence, the four C's of deterrence. We can break it down that way, but fundamentally it is about wanting to defend what matters most. And we need to look at the strategic realities. Our continent is the smallest of all the continents. Our member states have small territories. It is the intrinsic condition of Europe that we cannot mount a defense in depth. We are the opposite of Russia from that perspective. According to pretty much any scenario whereby the Russians would manage to punch through into the Baltic states, The Baltic states are extremely small territories, small populations, relatively flat landscapes. The Russians could basically impose a fait accompli pretty quickly unless we are extremely well prepared to throw them out or to deter them before they start. My biggest concern now is that implicitly within the discourse, I see a trend towards being afraid of the potential future fight with the Russian Federation, hoping it won't happen. That's a healthy instinct, of course. It's rational to hope it will not happen. But we're almost on a trend towards resigning ourselves to the fact that that fight may come and that we're going to have to face it in the manner that is presented to us. Because on balance, my interpretation of how EU policies are formulated from this perspective of by denial versus by punishment is that we always put a lot more attention on the denial aspect, which is effectively a resilience aspect. Whenever Europe faces a new threat, we are very good at having discussions on resilience. Why? Because it's less provocative to the external actors, and I think it maybe chimes better with our idea of the European Union as a peace project. I think it's easier for our political cultures to think that way. We are really quite different as compared to our American colleagues. But the reality is this: if you want to fundamentally deter the Russians from attacking somewhere in Eastern Europe, our own fellow member states, you have to communicate credibly to the Russians that we will commence firing missiles into their territory from the very first second of them moving in the wrong way. I'm not suggesting preemptive war, obviously, but I'm suggesting that in terms of our political culture, we have to define what it means that the European Union is a peace project. We actually have to say what it means rather than just say peace project. The suggestion I propose can be said to be inspired by the German Constitution, which is a prohibition of aggression. That's our real value. That's our real value. Think about it. Since 1945. We don't do aggression. We fundamentally believe that aggression is wrong. And the most shocking thing about Russia's attack against Ukraine is that it is the crime of aggression in its purest form. And it shocks our citizens, it shocks our societies, it shocks our governments. If you look at skepticism in Europe towards the United States, what was the moment, apart from now, which is maybe more on the atmospherics partly, but what was the relatively recent historical moment where we felt the least comfortable with our American colleagues? It was the Iraq invasion in 2003, which one could argue back and forth whether it was aggression. It was on the limit, certainly. Not as much as Russia invading Ukraine. Obviously, the cases are very different. But you could say that it was a war of choice at minimum. And it's not really the European way to do a war of choice. But fundamentally, we can uphold the idea that we will never commit aggression, and yet we will do everything to protect our territories, our citizens, our cities, every square inch. But in order to be able to do that, we need to rethink deterrence at the fundamental level. And starting from that, the capabilities we need to invest in will sort of write themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Am I right when you defined, deterrence with the 4 C's, that you emphasized a lot credibility? That credibility is one of the main factors in these 4 C's. If there is obviously not a hierarchy in these 4 C's, but I have the impression, based on what you said, that credibility is actually you want to emphasize today. Is this correct?
I really emphasize all of them because it's an all of the above problem. But credibility is obviously connected. It's connected also with cohesion. If we see cohesion failing, then that may harm credibility. If we do not have sufficient capabilities, then credibility is harder to communicate. If you communicate badly, then credibility suffers. I would say that in the course of the Russia-Ukraine war, we have had multiple instances of governments, as I mentioned, not only European ones, but also the United States, do what I call broadcasting fear. And Biden did it repeatedly. It was so obvious that he was afraid. And that we cannot have. That's bad communication. And that also affects credibility, of course.
Proud of being.
Sorry. Or shall we continue?
No, it's just very, very briefly, since in the room, and I don't know who's remotely following. But yes, I use the left and I'm using the right microphone. Of course, here in the room, there's a lot of policymakers, members of the parliament, and we heard, well, from Edward that policies are weak, not very comprehensive. And I just read the news that Europeans, Iran is proposing to meet European counterparts before the US talks and so on. And the questions on the principal stance on the policies from European legislators, they're kind of are flawed in a way of not consistent and principled stance. And the question is, this is the first time we speak of two regimes jointly, because usually Europeans, we look at the topics separately, Russia separately, Iran separately, but how this is all interconnected. And I understand right now it's going to be, discussion among the experts to really identify what are those weak spots that we're having. Even here in European Parliament, we have numerous resolutions adopted pushing for executive branches to adopt either the EU Council or the Commission, for example, designating IRGC as a terrorist entity, designating Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. Nothing of that happens. And what does that tell about EU policymakers? Are we determined to break down these alliances and confront the threats that are posed both by Russia and Iran? And that is my understanding. It's good to have the background and the mentality for both regimes and the modus operandi, but it seems in Europe we're lacking the strategic depth on how we are having consistent policies. And last but not least, though, I wanted to point out, Sarah elaborated on this technological cooperation between Iran and Russia. Russia being member of the Security Council, there are international sanctions against Iran, arms in particular area. And you mentioned Shahed drones. For the matter of fact, just half a year ago, Shahed drone fell out of sky in Latvia, fully loaded and crash landed. And this is, again, the response. We're going to build our deterrence readiness and so on. The question is, are we actionable in what Edward mentioned, that we show the force? Not only we talk about deterrence, keep on attacking us, we're just going to build deterrence. Is there a point where certain countermeasures should be taken, of course, in calibrated way? Thank you.
Thank you. We are now engaging in, let me say, a panel discussion, panel debate, but allow me to confront you with a certain idea that somewhere lingers in our Western societies, and is as follows. I mean, sometimes it's said, why are we afraid of Russia? Saying that if you add up all our military defense budgets in Europe, it's a multi-factor of what is existing in Russia, more or less. This is how the saying is going. Another thing is, look, the whole the land forces of Russia are depleted in Ukraine. Why are we afraid? For the record, I do not agree with this kind of saying, but sometimes this is, a narrative that is lingering somewhere, pushing, our politicians toward a so-called peace deal as soon as possible. Let the fighting stop in Ukraine. That's the main idea. How would we react to this kind of narrative? Do you have some thoughts on this narrative, this discourse? Yes, please.
Well, I think I'll give an insight based on the differences between national perceptions within Europe, because they are very, very significant. So I'm affiliated with I work for a Finnish institution. I actually live in Brussels, but I do work directly for them, and I lived for a while in Helsinki. And I was struck by how different the mentality is there. And I mean at all levels of society. And colleagues or researchers, people who've been in and out of government in Finland, but also just ordinary citizens I met. The difference between the mentality there and, for example, the mentality in Germany or Austria, or I lived several years in Austria as well. So just think Austria, Finland. These are two European countries that during the Cold War were in a very superficial way similar, because they were sort of not aligned, something like that, and they were venues for East-West dialogue, etc., both of them each in their own way. But the national cultures could not be more different. And I think that it is a question of historical learning. The older I get, the more I think that studying memory is really important, although I'm an economist by training, but now I'm beginning to think more and more that historians have a lot to teach us. The Finns fundamentally learned that fighting back works. And the Austrians learned that fighting is pointless because you get steamrolled. I don't want to oversimplify this, but quite frankly, that's actually it. And I know that this is actually it because I was told it by a veteran Austrian civil servant. I won't name him, and it was a long time ago. But I was railing on about how potentially threatening Russia might be. This was back 15 years ago. And after a while, he agreed with everything I was saying, but then after a while he said, but look, I did the strategic planning for the Austrian Defense Forces, and if the Russians really want to, and if the Russians had wanted back then, coming from Hungary and Czechoslovak territory back then, they would have overrun us in 2 days, and it was completely pointless. The Finns never accepted that logic. The reality is that Russia can lose wars. James mentioned it before. The Finns know it. The Poles know it. I'm not sure that there's sufficient critical mass of decision makers and leading cultural figures in countries like Germany, Austria, or for that matter, Belgium or France, have that knowledge, that insight that number one, Russia can lose wars. We can make them lose. And it doesn't necessarily escalate to nuclear. That seems to be a very American obsession, but not only American. The Russians, or if you like, the USSR, was effectively defeated in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and they withdrew. And they didn't keep any of the territory. For that matter, the United States was defeated in Vietnam. So nuclear-armed states, even very large ones, can lose wars, and they can basically go back home with their tail between their legs. And besides, even if we were afraid of nuclear escalation, we do have nuclear weapons as well. Let's not forget, our French colleagues have nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom has nuclear weapons. So even if the US is no longer around, we can deter the Russian Federation. We can impose unacceptable costs on them, and therefore the fight may well never come to nuclear except signaling. And it is a conventional fight. They can't even defeat Ukraine. How the hell would they defeat Ukraine plus all of us? We can make them lose.
I think there is a lot of self-deception in the comment you refer to, that we worry too much about Russia and its strengths, and they're really not going to be ready or capable of waging a war against Europe for some incalculable period of time. Because it is often those very people who are the most reluctant to have Ukraine press its own military advantages when they exist, to have Western weapon systems deployed as they were meant to strike targets they're meant to engage. And so you have to ask yourself, why does this apparent contradiction exist? And I think it's because many people who make the kind of statement you quoted are trying to reassure themselves in order not to take any risks in the current fight with Russia. In 2022, a very prominent Russian state intellectual, who is, I'm sure, known to a number of people in this room, I've known him myself for, I don't know, 35 years, Dmitry Trenin, wrote an article entitled Fear in Geopolitics, the importance of fear in geopolitics. Fear works, he said. Now, coming back to Edward's discussion earlier, and he centered the discussion about deterrence around punishment and denial. The Russian focus in thinking about deterrence is on intimidation and fear. In fact, what we tend to call hybrid war and think of as something below the threshold of kinetic war and overt armed conflict is in the Russian taxonomy much closer to being a form of deterrence, a preventive form of deterrence by making the adversary afraid. The adversary doesn't have to be afraid of conventional forces, half of whom might be on crutches attacking the Finnish border, but does have to be afraid about all the electricity going off, all the heating going off, about ships being sunk, basic communications cables being severed, satellites being blown up in outer space. This is part of deterrence too, creating all of this. On every occasion, any halfway informed, rational person knows who cut X, who did Y, but repeats in the New York Bar Association manner, there's no conclusive evidence about X, Y, or Z. This form of deterrence, of aggressive deterrence, is vindicated in Russia. And I think we must focus on that. Edward mentioned that the United States telegraphed the fact that it was afraid. I think President Biden was almost proud of the fact that we were afraid. Look how responsible we are. We understand how nuclear weapons are threats to all mankind. He persuaded the Russians in 2021 that he was afraid. That whole enterprise in 2021 was not an enterprise in deterring Russia from attacking Ukraine, but persuading them not to. And doing this by economic means that would be painless. Not understanding with a country like Russia, the combination of economic threats in the abstract and a complete absence of coercive power or any sign that you're willing to use it is not a deterrent, it's an inducement. So Edward has put all this very well. I won't restate it. We are getting the relationship between the whole and the parts fundamentally wrong. We do not understand it. And if you want to make an argument that we do, you will not be able to make an argument, at least not with us in the room, that we understand these things the way the Russians understand them. And if we're going to deter them, we have to understand how they think about these matters.
I'd like to follow up on those very clear remarks. It is clear from what Edward and James have just said that Russia has indeed won the information warfare. And at the beginning, the strategic logics of the Russians was to prevent the involvement of NATO in late February 2022 by using ustrashenie, this technique of intimidation or disorientation of the adversary to freeze the adversary from acting. It's not only frightening, it's about making your adversary unclear or disoriented about your real objectives. And James and Edward, as you have mentioned, the Russians speak in multiple voices. You have the clear and diplomatic voice that is sending a rational message, and you have all those lunatics on Russian television sending other messages, and they've been playing with that. This being said, when we speak about deterrence, especially by punishment, we are caught, and when I say we, I say the Western world, in a dilemma. The dilemma between reacting too late and too little. That's what we did in Ukraine by calibrating with all the Biden-type sophistication, even though the Russians were losing on the battlefield, or reacting too early and too strong. Because if we act too early and too strong, we might reach what's called the culminating point of deterrence, when the show of force is becoming counterproductive and is taking you into a spiral that you don't want it, that you want to avoid. And this is a dynamics that, for example, Israel and Iran have experienced over the past year. What are you striking? Which scope? What is the target? And what is the intended result? And this is an extremely tricky dynamics for the Western military, especially when you are confronted with states and societies whose basis is the idea of a permanent war. No threshold, no border between a time of peace and a time of war. This is an integral, continuous war with your adversary. And this is, I think, if we want to refine our conversation, deterrence by punishment, yes, but how? What is the target? What is the scope? What is the intended result? For example, in the Russian and the Iranian case, we have a shift from a balance between conventional and nuclear forces to an over-nuclearization of the military, of the rhetorics, of the capacity building, and of the deterrence. And this is an equilibrium that we need to keep in mind in order to apply smart power. And this is a conversation I would love to hear you, James, and Edward about the equilibrium of forces and the culminating point of deterrence. The Russians have learned a lot during this war. The Russians and the Iranians are learning powers. I think our rhythm of learning is slower. And one thing they learned about this war is strategic communication, and the Russians have established a new unit in the general staff, which is the unit of interpreting of strategic signaling. How the signals are being interpreted and understood within your adversary system. And I think that along the application of force, we should devote thinking about how the application of force will be interpreted and understood by and processed by our adversaries.
Come back immediately, if I can, Sarah. Of course, one understands the intricacies, but I think rather than frame this problem in terms of intricacies and delicacies, we ought to just present it as a basic issue of military strategy. This is what military strategy does, okay? Russia I'm not saying that this is likely or this is the way it would play out. Russia goes into Narva, goes into Latgala, bang. NATO, in response, 24 hours, destroys Kaliningrad Oblast as a military entity, whatever else happens there. Russians say, well, of course you mustn't do this, even if it's done completely by conventional means, which we have the ability to do, because we have all these nuclear weapons and we could destroy the British and US homeland. Oh, really? Well, the best of British luck to you then, could be our answer. But this is something military strategy has to engage with in each of these contingencies, and at certain levels in the Pentagon, and even today in Whitehall, bless their hearts, there are people who are thinking through problems of this kind in a responsible way.
Yes.
Just to address directly what Sarah was driving at, which was really excellent. And I'd like to make a point here, because I'm sure many people in the room have heard about escalation management, escalation ladder. I mean, that was a lot of the thinking underpinning how the Biden administration reacted and how, in fact, most European governments reacted. And it was always a back and forth, or should we supply this capability to Ukraine or not? We need to break away from this logic. I believe that the empirical evidence in favor of 1970s style theories of escalation, I think those theories are a bit weak, or they're a bit primitive, and potentially misleading. When I talk about deterrence by punishment, I do not necessarily mean, it's not simply an immediate rush to the use of nuclear weapons. That's not what I imply. I imply other forms of punishment, which would be carried out mainly by conventional means, or maybe only by conventional means. But just to give you one inspiring example, which I hope people in this room will like, a question. Do you think that the Russian Federation should have a navy? Personally, I'd rather they didn't have one at all, and certainly not on the western side of the Russian Federation. Ideally, I would like them to not be in the Baltic Sea, because I have many friends in the littoral states to the Baltic Sea, and I would also rather not have them in the Black Sea or the Mediterranean or the North Sea or the North Atlantic. The fact is, these are our seas, and we need to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves. And here the Ukrainians have really led by example. I mean, they pretty much sent the Black Sea back to Novorossiysk using drones. And some European countries helped them a little bit with those drones, but the Ukrainians did a lot themselves. We can do this. And the Russian Navy is pretty vulnerable in the Baltic Sea, potentially. Sorry. We can have long-range coastal defenses on the Gulf of Finland, between Estonia and Finland, also between between Denmark and Sweden. I mean, there's some pinch points here that can be exploited. Of course, we have pretty good naval assets as well. We can and should build more. And I mean, just think about it. Remember what happened just before the full-scale invasion started. Russia mounted a naval blockade against Ukraine. I'm sure maybe some people have forgotten now, but that was what was happening in the run-up to the war. One of the things that was happening. I mean, to be clear, we should never allow Russia to do that against any European country ever again. They tried to do that, we sink the lot of them. But here's my point about punishment. I think that we could develop sufficient capabilities which would be such that we could signal in advance to the Russian Federation that should they launch a wider war against, that would involve EU member states, that in that case, we would take the view that they should never have a navy again. We will destroy their navy, and we will prohibit the Russian Federation from having a navy, like as an open-ended commitment, as an imposition, as a punishment, a strategic punishment. Why that idea? Well, because even though Russia is, of course, traditionally a land power, they do need, just like any other ambitious great power, they do want to project force, they do want to sail around, they do want to go to their base in Syria, etc., etc. So if we demolish their navy and basically take control of their maritime trade to be overseen by us, this would be a unilateral imposition. but we would have good cause to do so. And this is something we would have probably the capabilities to do that, and we could credibly threaten them. At least materially, it could be credible. And we could make common cause with the Ukrainians, of course, in trying to achieve that outcome. So that's one idea of deterrence by punishment, sort of a bit out of the box.
If I may follow up on your points, Edward and James, when we think about in terms of deterrence by punishment, there is a key element that we've learned the hard way during the wars in Ukraine, but also in Israel, which is the element of masses. Because if I'm not mistaken, according to the assessment, for example, of the French Ministry of Defense, France would be able to sustain a high-intensity war with Russia no more than 2 weeks, because we are lacking the arsenal, we are lacking the masses in terms of human resources, artillery, tanks, air defense, an economy. And because we've built our militaries, I see we, the West, based on the idea of a contactless war, based on a high-quality intelligence, high-quality and modern air force, but we failed to understand that maybe the next war will come, as an Estonian friend recently told me at the conference that we attended with Joris in Finland, from 5 million drones coming from Russia, okay? From very low quality masses that can freeze and paralyze a country. So before we come up with a very sophisticated military strategy, we have to make sure that our arsenal is quantitatively calibrated to sustain the kind of response that we will suffer from our adversary. And as James mentioned, they know that soft points. They know that the soft belly, that the truth of the matter is that European societies are not willing and not able to sustain and experience a long-term protracted war. And I would make the argument that the reason why Ukraine and my home country, Israel, made it through somehow is not only because of their own militaries and outside support, is because they are built on societies that have experienced extermination and that have developed very strong grassroots autonomous capacity. At the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, as my Ukrainian friends told me in Kiev, Kiev would have fallen without this human life line of defense of Ukrainian civilians. In the Western Negev, Israel might have fallen without the heroic human life line of defense of young boys and women who were defending the country. And this is a capacity. It's not about masses. It's about education. It's about human force and intelligence that need to be reshaped in Western societies to confront and deal with the kind of protracted, long-term, high-intensity wars that Russia and Iran and the axis of evil want to engage and launch against us.
Yes, I briefly just wanted to come in on this. Edward mentioned, abolishing the Russian Navy. Well, we speak now on the conventional means, but unconventional means. Russia has this scrap fleet, shadow fleet. They have developed these capabilities that spreads the fear, the instability. Look, for the past year and a half, dozen of cables severed in the Baltic Sea, somewhat as well China involved. And this is where maybe from the point of view of Israel, maybe I will not be popular, but mentioning the pager operation, that sent a clear message to Iranian proxies and whatever, that you can actually penetrate deep into their ranks and so on and paralyze any operation. So is there any capabilities, unconventional that actually the West can put to action? Thank you.
James?
Can I provide, if Sarah will allow me, an Israeli example that answers that question? I'm sure she will remember what was called, I think it was in 2009, the Arctic Sea Affair, which was the beginning of something that lasted until shortly before the Hamas attack on Israel, which was the very specific, very tough Netanyahu-Putin relationship. The Israelis understood perfectly well, as did US intelligence, that Russia was helping Iran evade sanctions. The Israelis had concrete knowledge of exactly what equipment and hardware was on a particular ship proceeding from the Baltic to Iranian ports. And guess what they did? In the high seas, the Israelis sent a small boat with commandos, seized the ship. The Russians knew it. What was the Russian response? It was not thinking, oh my God, we have lots and lots of nuclear weapons and we can do X and Y. No, of course not. It was panic. Netanyahu then discreetly contacted Putin in Sochi. He said, I have some interesting documents and photographs for you, and he was invited to Sochi immediately, and suddenly the relationship changed. This was force that was intelligently calibrated with premeditation. That is what one does. The fundamental here in all these areas that we are discussing is that force must be used as a tool of policy if it is to have any utility at all. The fact that Russia has bastions of largely invulnerable SSBNs, strategic submarine, strategic missiles buried under the Arctic ice, is irrelevant to a number of the circumstances we find ourselves now dealing with increasingly on a monthly basis, and need not paralyze us. We have to be able to think in very specific terms. Now that is basic. Force remains, it will remain, a tool of policy if it is to have any utility at all. And if you don't understand that, you should not be allowed anywhere near these decisions. But therefore, what is urgently needed is that those people in Europe and in Ukraine, incidentally, who have strategic competence, come together and convene two discussions that are related. The first is, where do we want to be in future? In 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time? What decisions need to be made? What resources need to be allocated to put us there so that many of the Russian options that appear to exist today, we could draw a blue line through them and then along that. But secondly, more urgently, what can be done with the forces we have today? Emmanuel Macron today is the only European leader who says he is willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine in a deterrence role without a US guarantee and without Russia's consent. Keir Starmer doesn't like saying it, but he is absolutely unwilling to put them there without a US guarantee and without Russian consent. Okay, but still one has to go through the exercise. President Macron, do you have an answer? What happens if those Russian forces are attacked, if those French forces are attacked? Now, he has part of an answer already because it's understood that their purpose will be to act as a backstop to Ukrainian forces so that they could do more and we will help them do more. And therefore, there's no scenario under which we will be attacking Russian forces. But there might be scenarios in which Russian forces will be attacking us. What is our response? Part of the reason we need to convene that first group to discuss what can we do with capabilities today is to be able to answer that question. Maybe at national level in France, They already have an answer to that question. I hope so. I am depressingly confident that in the UK, we do not have an answer to that question. I don't know if Edward has a different view from mine.
I don't have an answer, but since I'm having a good time being a bit provocative, I'm going to be provocative again. I think we should mention much more often in public discourse and in political discourse the fact that if we were to enter the current war on Ukraine's side and directly go to the front line and shoot Russians, this would be legal. It would be lawful, completely under international law, because Ukraine has a right to have allies. We can choose to become Ukraine's allies. It doesn't matter that the war has already started. The fact is that Russia is guilty of the crime of aggression. It is unlawfully on Ukrainian territory. Ukraine has the lawful right to expel the invader. And we have a lawful right to assist the state that is being invaded. Actually, any country in the world can join the war on Ukraine's side tomorrow. It would be 100% legal. Whereas any country that supports the aggression, like Iran, North Korea, etc., that's 100% illegal. It's participation in aggression. So just to make that point, which is not a political reality, certainly not immediate, but the point is it's lawful. And I think it would be jolly good if a lot more politicians just said it in the media. You just say it. You're not advocating necessarily intervention, but you could say it. Just remind people of that reality.
Remind people.
Yes, exactly. I'm going to jump on some of the points that Sarah made earlier, and I'm going to use and abuse the 4C, 5C, 6Cs framework. Okay, so the starting point was capability, credibility, communication. And then Sarah, of course, very rightly added capacity, right? I mean, do we have enough munition? No, we don't. And the Russians have lots of munition. We've been struggling, but progress is being made. But it is true that there are alarming reports about how long we would last if we had to fight with the intensity that the Ukrainians have had to fight. And it's not just about how much ordnance we produce. It's also, we've also discovered that some of the systems that we believed were good enough for high intensity warfare, actually the wear and tear gets pretty bad. Some systems have been revealed to be better than others. This is something for military specialists, but that's something to take into consideration. A lot of countries are in the business of producing more artillery shells, among others, bringing back home or redeveloping the supply chain for producing explosives. France is doing it, the UK is doing it, several other countries. And that's important as well. There's a war economy connection here. We cannot be reliant on China or some other countries that are not reliable for important parts of that supply chain. We need to be able to produce our own explosives, our own ordnance, all of that. So that would bring us, I had 4 C's: capability, credibility, communication, and cohesion. You add capacity. So that's 5. Cohesion breaks down into 2 things. So this is another point from Sarah. I meant cohesion among countries, so the strength of an alliance, but obviously Sarah, of course, raised the incredibly important point of cohesion within our societies, whether we can mobilize our people and whether we fall apart. And it is absolutely true. The Ukrainians have really given us a shining example of how people can cope in a context where state capacity is not always great, where there's all sorts of challenges. But ever since 2014, so many voluntary efforts to get supplies to the front line, with soldiers complaining, I don't have this kit, that kit. And all these voluntary efforts that still go on to this day have been absolutely remarkable. And of course, Israel has an extraordinary degree of cohesion, but naturally you have a national service model and everybody does military service and it's a small territory and you have a very specific history naturally. So that's very specific. I think, and you know, within Europe, I mean, we have Nordic and Baltic nations that have, aside from the issue of specific minorities, that do have some of the benefits of that higher cohesion. And you can see it's not a coincidence. In the Nordic Baltic region, you're more likely to find relatively credible total defense concepts. Smaller populations, quite distinct national identities, also a historical trauma, not the same as that of the Jewish people, of course, but nonetheless, a sense of being small and vulnerable and that you really need to stick together. Otherwise, you're going to be in terrible, terrible trouble. So cohesion really breaks down into these 2 things. And I'll add a 6C, which is compensation, because it has to start with a C, but by that I mean offsets, right? So the way that our American colleagues addressed all of these problems, notably having to face the Soviet Union and its superior investment in capacity, was to try to do technological offsets. And we are an technologically advanced continent, and we do have a lot of money. So we can play the game of offset as well. And Ukraine has played the game of offset, even though it's a very small economy. So we can do that too. We have to embrace, we have no choice. We have to embrace the drone revolution. But I have on my list here, think of directed energy weapons. The UK has had some very, very interesting recent results. By God, we should embrace this and accelerate it. But we have to have systems that enable us to embrace innovation. And there's been a lot of work on this. On the NATO side, there's Diana and NIF, etc. And there's defense innovation work on the EU side and national side. As a matter of fact, I was involved in some of that on the NATO side some years ago. So lots of great speeches. But the point is, we do need to find a way to be readier on very short time horizons. I'm terribly concerned when I hear, yeah, well, maybe the Russians will be ready to attack us in 2030, so we have to be ready by 2030. That's terrifying to me to hear that. Because no central point estimates, please, not 5 years ahead, because in 5 years' time, most government ministers who are coming to ministerial meetings to the city will no longer be in government. No, please, oh God, no, not a 5-year framework. We have to have at national and EU level a concept of what we can do within the next 6 to 12 months to increase our readiness and our ability to defend ourselves, and what we can do within 2 to 3 years, 5, 6 years, 10 years plus. Absolutely fine. I'm not saying we shouldn't do midterm, long-term planning. We should. But we have to have also low-hanging fruit, and I think maybe the example of drone forces is one where we can learn a lot from the Ukrainians. We should learn from the Ukrainians. We should send, it's good to train the Ukrainians, but we should send personnel to Ukraine to be trained by the Ukrainians in how to run a large-scale drone force. And this is large-scale stuff. It's millions of drones, which means also battle management systems that the Ukrainians have been developing using AI as well. Do we have something like that? I don't know if we're as good as the Ukrainians, quite honestly. So we should embrace the disruption. Thank you.
Allow me to develop a small thought and wrapping up our discussion here. I mean, it was said that we should learn from history. One of the results of my study of the Russian military culture is that it is still a mass army in all its aspects. Shouldn't we return a little bit in Europe more to that concept, so that we have built the capacity, or our states, our civil societies, and so on, are more, directed towards a defense and security mentality that is related with the mass army concept from the past. So that, James, Macron sending the French forces not just as a signaling, but as a sustained operation, so that we have the capacity and the capabilities of not just for a couple of weeks sending their French forces to signal the Russians something, but a fighting force if necessary, a sustainable force. That's so, and therefore my thought that we perhaps should introduce some more elements of the mass army of the past back into our societies. But anyway, that's a small thought of mine. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for the excellent and thought-provoking contributions. Thank you for that. And I would like now to make some time for the question and answer sessions. Therefore, I kindly invite you, the audience, if you have a question to raise, and may I also ask you to identify yourself very shortly, and then keep it to questions, please, and not too long to comments. Thank you. Yes, please.
So thank you very much for this interesting conference. My name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics, and I am a member of the European Physical Society. And I have a question. I'm very interested in the strategical military cooperation and defense between EU, Ukraine, and Israel. And I have two questions. Why Israel is not a NATO member? Why? Because I think that Iran will think 2 times before attack Israel if Israel become a NATO member. That it's only another one. The question that I'm more interested is how can we use, I mean, EU, Ukraine, and Israel forces and new technology to stop the helping between Iran and Russia. Russia is helping Hezbollah, is helping Houthis with military and strategical information and military arms. And Iran help Russia with drones, and I don't know with how other things because it's not so clear. I know that the Israeli army and Ukraine army is using new technology, and I think that it's a very important step. How can we, it's a soft war, but it's very, very effective. That is my question. How can we use this? The other thing is Iranian intercontinental missile. Now in the talks between Trump and Iran, what is with this missile? It's a missile we can have in Europe one, and you can have in Israel the same missile. That's it's very important. Why Europeans are not present to this discussion? That is not so clear from me. And last question is, Russia has now military troops concentrated to near the Finland frontier, and they are saying they are doing some military, I don't know, exercise. They say the same things when before to attack Ukraine. So my question is how Europe see this concentration, how Europe is doing against this.
You can respond, Sarah?
Maybe I will take up the questions related to the Middle East, and then and leave it to you on the Finland and the Baltic states. Regarding Israel and NATO, historically NATO was established to counter another threat. And historically, Israel has not been invited to this alliance for clear historical reasons. And I would, I mean, when in my career, I had many discussions within our community in Israel about NATO-Israel cooperation. And once the matter of the fact is that no Israeli mother will accept to have her son die for another country when we are living under the looming threat of an extermination. And I think this is the simple answer, but the more complex answer is that historically NATO alliance was not connected, of course, to the Middle East and to Israel, but there's been a growing cooperation between NATO and especially what is happening on its southern flank and Israel in terms of countering Russian strategic signaling in the Eastern Mediterranean. So you have a growing and more complex relationship and exchange of ideas between NATO and Israel to counter that common threat. Regarding the potential Ukrainian, European and Israeli cooperation, I see a venue for increased cooperation in intelligence sharing to contain the Russian and Iranian circumvention of sanctions, which has been massive. I have to say that they've been able to really evade and escape the sanctions more effectively than we thought. And second, of course, and this is already happening, by strengthening our deterrence by denial through extended cooperation in air defense. And this is a domain in which Israel has a strong operational experience, both as a country, but as a country that has cooperated with the United States and European countries, and of course, Gulf countries. And Ukraine has a very strong operational experience. And I think this is interesting to learn from two armies that has fresh, multi-domain, and rich operational experience. I often made the argument that Ukraine is the most functional and the most experienced army on the European continent. And this is an army, as Edward mentioned earlier, we should come and learn from the Ukrainians, and maybe Israel, with its mistakes and some of its successes, can also be a good source to learn from. In terms of technology, as Edward mentioned, and James also, the drone warfare is one of the most rapidly evolving domains. And I would say that Ukraine is at the forefront in terms of technological development, but also operational successes. In fact, in the last months, according to reports by the Institute for the Study of War, Ukraine is the leading country in terms of drone warfare, both in terms of offensive and defensive capabilities. And I think this is something to take into account. And in the coming months, as you said, Edward, I mean, in the Middle East, we count in terms of days and weeks, in Europe in terms of months. In the coming months, I think, should Europe reframe its strategies, Europe should sit with the Ukrainian military and perhaps the Israeli military and learn fast from this operational, freshly acquired operational experience. And of course, on the Finnish question, I'll leave it to you.
Can we first go to James and then to James?
I'm grateful that in response to the NATO question, Sarah pointed out that there are not only certain historically founded and geopolitically founded taboos inside NATO and giving a positive answer to that, but there are some in Israel as well. And I want to add one. Israel is not part of the sanctions regime against Ukraine. They have had carefully calibrated but decidedly ambivalent response to the war in Ukraine. Why is that? Because Israel relies upon real and tacit understandings with Russia with regard to what happens in its own neighborhood, and therefore does not want to put itself on a collision course with Russia and define Russia as an enemy. And that relates most directly to Syria, although that problem has now changed somewhat, but it also relates directly to Iran. And therefore, for those reasons alone, in today's environment, I can't envisage a government of Israel coming to the conclusion that Israel would secure more security from being a member of NATO than from playing a game that is very usefully played now. Now, I will defer to Edward, but on the Finnish question, let me just make 2 points. I don't see any utility to Russia deploying these forces on the Finnish border, except in the context of shaping what remains possible, which is a proper regional war in the Baltics, which would tie some Finnish forces down that might possibly be used elsewhere. The Finns rightly have absolutely no lack of confidence regarding their ability, short of serious nuclear contingencies, their ability to defend their national territory against Russia. The Russians understand the Finns' ability to do this. There is no such thing as hybrid war in Finland. Sadly, there is in Estonia, because the one major difference between Finland and Estonia is that inside the country, there is no Russian factor, at least when it comes to society. Everybody in Finland knows everybody else. You can't pretend to be somebody you're not in Finland without being discovered in 72 hours. So war in Finland has to take a very simple and direct form, and we know what happens when Finland is attacked. The whole country, which is semi-mobilized already, becomes fully mobilized, and the attacker regrets the choice he's made within 48 hours, if not 2. So Edward might have more to say about that.
That's absolutely right. I mean, Finland has a very strong total defense concept. It has conscription. It has very competent armed forces. It's a relatively well-armed state, even in terms of infantries. It's relatively better than most other European countries. It also has much better civil protection. It really has a total security concept. For those who have visited Helsinki and who've had the luck of having a bit of a tour, there's some amazingly large underground facilities, which are really quite ample and which Finland developed during the war. So really all aspects of warfare. Oh, another example is the Finns have something called NATO, which is basically a security of supply agency for all the goods and services that matter for the continuity of every function of the country, not just military, but also civilian. I have a very good friend of mine who was a senior official there for many years. It's amazing how good the Finns are at that kind of thing. I mean, they've been thinking about supply chain security, for a long time, and they never stopped doing it. And of course, they understand their geography. So I'm not worried about the Finns, and I would add, I mean, there's a couple of positive points here. Nordic defense cooperation is evolving quickly. It's been good for a long time, but I mean, it's even better now. Of course, there wasn't up when Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Now it's a bit of a downer that the US is less reliable, but nonetheless, Sweden and Finland are both in the EU and the Nordics working together very well. And Sweden obviously offers depth to help Finland further. Obviously, it's a bigger concern with respect to the 3 Baltic states, which are more exposed. That's a challenge. The Finns are fantastic, but the Finns are very strongly focused on defending their own country. And I'll get to my last point, which is how I interpreted the question from the lady. Basically, something like, why does Europe tolerate the fact that Iran is developing dangerous long-range delivery systems? And this really goes back to my point about deterrence by punishment. Europe doesn't do deterrence by punishment, not fundamentally. If we did, we would arms race the Iranians and communicate to them that, well, okay, you want to build those weapons, maybe we can't stop you, but here's a range of our own weapons, and if you ever attack us, we will basically smash up whatever, all of your defense industry right here from Europe with missiles that have ranges of, what's the range, 3,000 kilometers we would need? I don't know exactly the distance from here to Tehran, but let's say 2,000–3,000 kilometers. But the thing is that that's simply not the way we do business, but obviously it should be. We should learn. I think fundamentally, I mean, one of the conclusions about this whole deterrence point, the deterrence by punishment point, is that with a less reliable United States, Europe must begin to think the way Americans were thinking in the 50s, 60s, 70s. To think grand strategy, deterrence, all types of deterrence. I'm not saying we should do only deterrence by punishment, and I'm not saying, like I said, it's not exclusively about nuclear, far from it. That's conventional punishment. But we have to develop the capabilities to do so, and we have to have the mentality of thinking that way. It's perfectly understandable that Europeans would not want an intervention, military intervention against Iran, because people think, well, it didn't go that well with Iraq, etc. I mean, that's understandable. But I mean, if the Iranians develop systems that are dangerous to us, we could at the very least arms race them. But that too is a political taboo in European politics. We don't like arms racing. Americans had no problem with it during the Cold War, but we are reluctant. But the fact is we have to arms race. And we should, because if we do arms race, we might even win. Think again to our bigger GDP. Thank you.
Yeah, very shortly, if I can indulge a moment of outrage, as Edward did earlier, but it's on this very theme still of deterrence by punishment. North Korea. The United States fought a 4-year war, high-intensity war against North Korea. Spent 3 years negotiating an armistice, which has remained intact, and now is turning a blind eye to the fact, something I'd never expect to see in my lifetime, that we have North Koreans fighting a war in Europe. It's not that Truman and Eisenhower roll over in their graves, they'd be jumping out of them, shouting at us. There was, under the Biden administration, the chair of the House of Representatives Intelligence Community, another Mike, I forget which Mike he is, the too many waltzes, the too many whites. What? Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Community wrote an open letter to President Biden, fantastic letter, expressing controlled outrage that we have Iranians fighting in Europe. He said this crosses a very serious red line. It calls for immediate and urgent action, and I am calling on you to giving you advance warning that we will be convening hearings to discuss this matter. Of course, the Democrats blocked it. Now, sadly, since Trump has become president, this particular congressman and a great many others have gone silent on the issue. Why are we going silent on the issue? And then, final point, everything is interconnected, isn't it? Aren't the Iranians noticing that the Americans are allowing North Korea to fight a war in Europe and not even putting this on the agenda as an issue to be negotiated when we talk about ceasefires and peace settlements? Good God. I mean, there are no secrets. Everyone's watching everything else and drawing conclusions. That's my moment. Sorry, I went on for more than a minute.
Thank you, James. Are there other questions in the audience, please? Yes, please, sir.
My name is Matthijs Schussler. I'm the director of ELNET, EU and NATO, and we're very happy to partner on this event with MEP Kols. Thank you very much for the very interesting remarks that you shared with us. I have a particular question, and maybe I'll just leave it open to whoever wants to answer. But earlier on in the discussion, we touched upon the United States and their role with regard to Russia and also Iran, and how everybody is looking how the cake will be divided and who will eat it first. But I would be interested to hear also from you. Where do you see Europe fit into this dividing of the cake? Because it's at least from my perspective, it seems that the European Union, the European member states do not always have a very strong or aligned position when it comes to Iran, to Russia much more. But obviously this whole context is becoming more complex also with the new administration in the US that has taken a different approach. So maybe you would be willing to share some of your reflections on this particular point. Thank you.
The one encouraging thing that is happening, that needs to happen, is there's been a marked diminution of the distinction in defense terms between EU and non-EU in Europe. And at this point, there's no proper place for such a distinction. I mean, the European defense without Britain does not make sense. And there are a whole host of other areas. And what is happening in the United States should be accelerating this. There is, a host of increasingly compelling reasons why Europe needs to build tangible capabilities to be able to pursue our own, defend our and maintain and defend our own interests by military means in a wider range of contingencies, if necessary, without the United States being present. So I see this as an imperative.
Yeah, if I may follow up directly, that's also, I think, fundamentally the point I was also trying to convey earlier when talking about deterrence. I think Europeans, either Europe learns to do grand strategy as a collective and also develops the sorts of reflections that the US was doing all the time during the whole Cold War, defining a place for itself in the world, deciding what values and interests are priorities, and then developing strategies that enable that and to ensure that one has the sufficient military capabilities to defend or uphold certain interests or values. That's what Europe needs to do. And it's either that or we are simply going to fragment along national lines, and then it's going to be, you know, differences in threat perceptions between East and West and North and South, and then we'll be buffeted by much more powerful states. The world we've entered now is a world of revisionist challenges and revisionist war. Russia kicked it off, but China is also in many ways a revisionist state. Iran is certainly a revisionist threat. North Korea is some sort of bizarre disruptor as well. I find it even hard to categorize exactly what they're doing in Ukraine, but obviously that we should not welcome that. The point is that this is an axis of revisionist states, fundamentally what we're facing. And the fact that we underreacted and that the US underreacted to it has meant that the axis has grown. It has firmed up. Everybody now has joined the war against Ukraine, which is a European democracy, which is a candidate to become a member of this union. I think that this is make or break moment now of the US becoming so unreliable, and with, in fact, Donald Trump, I think, arguably signaling probably that under president like him or presidents like him in future, the US will simply pay great power politics and will abandon ideals such as making the world safe for democracy and that kind of thing. If that's the world we're heading towards, and we probably are, at least temporarily, and maybe for the long term, then the only solution is for Europe to be collectively considerably stronger at a military level. And we also need to have strategic thinking in order to do that. And therefore, again, we need to do grand strategy for Europe. We need to know what we want to achieve in the world. We need to know what is acceptable to us and what is unacceptable to us. And just to expand that, so here's a few ideas. It's similar to the maritime stuff I was saying before. So here's an idea that's a little bit arrogant and expansive, but I'll say it on purpose. The Roman Empire used to refer to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum. Why should we not, and I think the Latin for our seas in plural is Maria Nostra, Nostra or Nostri, I don't know, but it sounds very elegant, right? The point is, we could decide, really we could theoretically decide that the seas around us are our seas, right? I mean, we could still stay within international law, but we could have this more expansive view of it. And if we wanted that, if that were a strategic objective, we could define it and we could build our naval capabilities accordingly and our coastal defense systems and so on, and treat the Russians a certain way and the Chinese a certain way. The reason why I keep on talking about maritime is because we have to be aware that the Chinese Navy is growing in leaps and bounds. I don't think they're going to stay forever just around China, are they? They might come a lot closer to us, so we have to think about that. But the point is, it's all of these dimensions of military power we have to consider, including possibly more European states acquiring nuclear weapons, or maybe a collective nuclear deterrent, although that's very complicated to manage. We have to think of everything, and we have to go back to the source. We have to think grand strategy, we have to think deterrence, we have to think strategic goals, and that's the answer, because otherwise, if we just say, what's going to happen to us as Europeans, how in the dividing of the cake, well, we will be the cake. We will be in pieces.
If I may add to what was said before, another aspect, I think it was an underlying theme in all the presentations here, is the question of naming, of language. The world that we're shaping is informed by the language we use. And what we're seeing in the US-Russian exchange, in the US-Iranian exchange, and in Europe's reaction, we have a loss of translation because of the very words that are being put to that reality. You have a second Trump administration that is based on the culture of deals, of commercial deals, in which you always reward the stronger, the aggressor. You have a strategic culture of Russia and Iran, of maskirovka, ustraszenie, of frightening, of fooling the enemy, by blurring the lines between war and peace, by blurring the lines between true and false. This is the Iranian approach of always fooling the Western strategic communities, of cultures of permanent war. And in between, you have the European continent, I would say the Western part of it, not the Eastern, that is using a language that is not adequate, not calibrated to the strategic realities it is located in. Member of Parliament Kols just made the remark to me that Europe is speaking in terms of readiness. It's not readiness, it's war, it's capacity building, it's coercion, this is deterrence, this is integrated deterrence. Readiness is not the right word. And I think that you, as European members of Parliament, as opinion leaders, the first work to be done is to work on terminology, lexicon, language, because terminology shapes policy, shapes approaches. And again, I think that just because lack of choices, Ukraine would be a good example to look into, maybe Israel. The way people speak about our current strategic and operational environments. And today we are in a tragic situation, tragic because there is no good solution, of the loss of translation between the Americans, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Europeans. We just don't speak the same language. And this loss of translation is tragic for the people of the region, for the people, for the Ukrainian people, for people in the Middle East. It does affect lives. It's a matter of life and death. This is just, it's not a matter of well-oiled and calibrated policy here in Brussels or in Strasbourg. People are dying because of this. And I think that the first work to be done is a work of language, terminology that needs to be inspired. And I will make that point by Eastern European members of the European Parliament because they know what historical trauma is. They've experienced firsthand what is German occupation, Soviet occupation. They know what it is. And I think we need to have a shift of language and policy towards the Eastern European part of Europe for the decade to come.
Yes. As a dedicated student of Lenin, may I just add one point, reinforcement about what I would term, what you've discussed, which I would term in Leninist vocabulary, linguistic struggle. If you read the Washington Treaty of NATO, only twice is the term peace used without qualification. On every other occasion, about, I don't know if it's 7 or 11 occasions, the terminology is always peace and security, peace and security. Why then are the spokesmen of this alliance today, people from this alliance today, talking about peace constantly in the context of this war, as opposed to saying the basis of our entire alliance system is the premise that countries have a right to be defended. We are interested in, there is the essential legitimacy to national and collective defense, and that is what we are trying to pursue. Peace is one of the most perilous terms that has ever been utilized, has been understood since the ancients. The fact is that there's been more atrocity and slaughter and liquidation and monstrosity committed in the name of peace as much as committed in war.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Is there still a question in the room? Okay. The speakers for sharing their experience and perspectives for us today. Thank you so much, James, Edward, and Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you also to all of you for your participation and your thoughtful questions. And this concludes actually our session, I believe. I wish you all a very good day, and we hope to see you again on future events.
Well, thank you, and concluding remarks from my side as well. Really, thank you, Mr. Blado, for navigating this panel discussion. I think the experts were really on top of the issue that we put forward today. And I can promise one thing: there won't be some recommendations, conclusions coming out. It's all of those who have been here present for the past 2.5 hours have digested what experts in their analysis have delivered both on Russia, on Iran, but also on, as Kremlin labels, collective West responses to these threats. But one good thing is that maybe the room, this chamber is not full, but I'm grateful for those who are also following today's discussion online, remotely. My assistants just reported we have reached almost more than 1,000 viewers. So it means, and it's an evident that this issue, this theme that we have put forward is timely, essential, and topical for general public, for European citizens as well. And as I mentioned, this is one of the series of discussions, so we can conclude today on Russia-Iran axis, but the axis is much broader. The next one we will focus in autumn, it's on Russia and China. James mentioned the presence of the North Koreans in Russia fighting Ukraine. It actually was officially announced that the recognition of North Koreans being present and engaged in this war is based on the agreement signed between Russia and North Korea that not very recently on mutual assurance and assistance clause. So we see that for the past span of 4 or 5 years, there are numerous agreements signed between these axes. We don't know maybe exactly all the contents, but we see the modus operandi. We see that, it's very evident, and the question is, everything that we heard today, deterrence by denial should move to deterrence by punishment. We are using this format as an open book that we're filling in with our knowledges, but also the challenges, the questions. So, of course, concluding the span of the series of these discussions, I think we, the policymakers, we have broader understanding where we stand in front of these axes and what should be done at the strategic level, but also operational level, and down to every European as well, as such. So with this, once again, thank you, panelists, speakers, experts, for your inputs. And I also would like to use the opportunity to thank my APAS as well, Chris, Laura, Ginta, and Yanis. They work in the background very hard so that we have smooth events. And well, with this, wish you a pleasant day. And let's stay tuned for the next event in a series of the axis of autocracies and how should the West will respond to the challenges posed by them. So thank you very much. And Edward, I'm pushing for EU to establish, so we have the banking union, energy union, seas union. Baltic, Adriatic, Mediterranean. We have our own legal framework, what you can do in those seas.